Okay, so you might be wondering why a guy that used to work for a state agency is teaching NEPA. Well, it's because John asked me to. I used to work in the habitat program with Game and Fish, and we put together an hour-long presentation on NEPA for our employees, and I've kind of pared it down a little bit. So a lot of the slides are actually the same ones that we used before. And so, these federal laws can be very confusing, all the acronyms, things like that. So does anybody remember the fellow on the right? It's Richard Stadicke. He used to run the Robbins Butte Wildlife Area, and he died from an illness. He got sick a lot, or he was in a motorcycle wreck and lost his spleen, and then later on he got a common cold and died from that. So, and that's Dana McGehee on the left, although he's hard to recognize here. NEPA is a very important law, and I think the reason why John wanted to have this as part of the program is because this is the framework that all federal actions hang on. And federal actions would include grazing plans, land management plans, highways, all sorts of different things. And it also is the framework that citizens can use to try to make change and implement change within these federal agencies. It's really the strongest leverage that people can have. So it's a very important law to understand. And it's a very short law, but it's very meaty. Certainly for biologists and people that are going to work in natural resources in the future, this law means employment. If it wasn't for NEPA, there would be a lot fewer biologists out there because the agencies need biologists to write the NEPA documents, and then other agencies need to hire biologists to review these NEPA documents. And then if you're working for a private consulting firm, you're going to need to know NEPA because you're going to be hired to do a lot of these NEPA documents. And some of them can be very expensive things. So it's a decision-making law. That's the basis of the law. It's not necessarily there to protect the environment, but it's there to force the federal agencies to make decisions based on facts. They need to collect information. They need to understand what the impacts of the project are going to be. They need to have a range of alternatives to select from. And they also need to do public scoping to get input from the public. It used to be when a highway was planned, they would just go out there and the engineers would kind of draw out the highway and kind of ignore all the input. And well, that's not the case anymore. So not with NEPA. So there needs to be a federal nexus, and that would be use of federal land, like a grazing permit on Forest Service or BLM land. Federal money might be involved, like using federal money to pay for a highway project or something like that. Or if there's a federal permit that is required, even though the project might be happening on private land with private money, like Del Webb might be putting in a housing development, but they have to maybe alter some of the streams. Well, then the Clean Water Act comes in and they need a 404 permit, which is administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. So then they need to do NEPA and follow its framework. NEPA involves big documents. I brought a couple here. I didn't bring a copy of the CEQ regulations, but these are online. And if you're going to get into NEPA, you should download a copy of the CEQ regulations and know it well. There's also the 40 questions that the Council on Environmental Quality put together, and they try to answer a lot of questions people would have about NEPA. And so that is also an important document for NEPA. And then each agency has their own rules and framework for implementing NEPA. So Forest Service is different from the BLM, and they're different from the Department of Defense, and they're different from the NRCS. I remember in about it was probably 1991, I went to a meeting with NRCS at their Plant Materials Center, and they were talking about all the successes they had introducing plants into the state. And I naively raised my hand and said, "Did you do NEPA on this?" And all the old guys in gray hair up there said, well, they didn't say anything. They were just they didn't have an answer that they wanted to tell me. So apparently at that time, they weren't doing NEPA. I think they do NEPA now, though. The objectives of NEPA are to consider every significant aspect of the environmental impact of the project, inform the public about the project and the effects, get their input, get the input from the public, They also need to develop viable alternatives and then make project decisions based on all available information. But they don't have to take the alternative that the public likes the most. That's not the purpose of NEPA, as much as it is to make the federal agencies go through the process of making an informed decision. That's what it's all about. There are 3 levels of analysis. One is a categorical exclusion, called a CE or a CX or a CADX. The next level up is an environmental assessment, and the highest level is an environmental impact statement. And I didn't bring a copy of a CADX. I have an environmental assessment here for Tonto Basin, Walnut, and 7K grazing allotments. This is an EA. Quite often these are written by agency staff. This is an EIS. This is for the Lower Sonoran and Sonoran Desert National Monument. It's with the BLM. Nowadays, these are mostly on disk. If you get a copy at all, it's on disk, or it might be online. I was lucky enough to get a printed one because I have a hard time, reading something this big on my little screen. While I'm unloading things, at the end, if you're interested, you can come and get, I made 75 copies. This is a really good summary of NEPA and how it's done. And it's put together by the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension. And it's 2 parts. First part is important points for public participation. And the second one is, information about how citizens can use NEPA. So it's a real handy guide. So we have 3 levels of analysis: categorical exclusion, the EA, and the EIS. First, so the lowest level is a CADX. And what they've done is, in this process of NEPA, there's some actions that are federal actions that are so insignificant that they're not really worth doing an EA or an EIS. And so the agency will put together maybe a list of these things, and they go through the NEPA process. They might do an EA or an EIS on all these categorically excluded projects. And if they don't get a lot of opposition to these projects, then they're on their list of categorically excluded projects. So categorically, they are excluded from further NEPA analysis. So these are things that do not have, or do not individually or cumulatively have a significant impact on the quality of the environment. So neither an EA or an EIS is required for a CADX. So the paperwork on these would be 2 or 3 pages long, I think. So examples would be, using a camp for field work. You're going to have an impact there, but it's not going to be much. Non-destructive data collection, monitoring, educational activities, modifying existing fences, salvaging dead or dying trees less than 250 acres, renewal of leases with no added rights. No-brainers, really. So if somebody's proposing something along this line, as long as it's on their list, they can get away with a CADX. Things that don't get away with a CADX are significant impacts of public health or safety, significant impact on natural resources, things that are highly controversial. If they're going to do something and you have a big problem with it, to some degree that might imply that there's a controversy here. If you don't agree with what is going on here and other people don't agree, I think by definition you have a controversy. So things that are highly uncertain, things that establish a new precedent, things with a cumulative impact. If you're messing with one spring, that might not be much of a problem. But if you're messing with 3, 4, 5, 20 springs in an area, that is a cumulative impact. And something, again, that would be a significant impact on TES, threatened and endangered species, or critical habitat. So, are the environmental effects likely to be significant? If it's no, it goes to categorical exclusion probably. If you're not sure what the impacts are going to be, you go to environmental assessment. Okay, so you're doing the environmental assessment to determine how big the impacts are. You really haven't gotten into this yet. You really don't know what all the problems are going to be. So you might start with an environmental assessment. If it's clear from the beginning that the impacts are going to be big, if this is a big project, you're going to spend a lot of money, you're going to do a lot of damage to the land, don't mess with an EA. You go directly to an environmental impact statement, this big one here. So an EA is to determine the significance of the environmental effects. And then you make your decision from the alternatives. And one thing about the environmental assessment is that you can, if you start to see that the impacts are going to be significant, you can do things to reduce them to insignificance through mitigation or alternative selection. You can pick another alternative that will have less of an impact, or if there's a critical resource out there that is going to be impacted to a significant degree, maybe you could reduce that impact in a number of ways. You might avoid that population of tortoises or something. You could reduce the number of livestock in the plan or whatever. So if you've reduced the impacts to a level of insignificance, then you go to a FONSI. FONSI, I like the words that they have in this thing. It reminds me of a television character here. So if you go to a FONSI, that's a finding of no significant impact. And then you can go forward on the project. But if impacts are going to be significant, you're going to have to do an EIS. So the EA is kind of a decision in itself, whether you should just go ahead with the project because it's not significant, or you can go the other way and you can do an EIS. And an EIS would cost, $30,000, $310,000. They start to get very expensive, and a lot of effort goes into those things. So with significance, you need to consider context and intensity. Consider society as a whole and also local effects, short and long-term effects, and amount of controversy. Intensity, the severity of the impact, both beneficial and adverse effects. You have to weigh these out. Effects on public health, parks, and the like. Precedent for future actions. Cumulative effects. Threatened and endangered species. Teeny species, those little teeny species. So all these things you need to consider if you're trying to determine if it's going to be a significant impact or not. Mitigation. Okay, so this is a big deal. If you have a significant impact, sometimes you can, it might not be enough to stop the project, but you can avoid doing an EIS if you can reduce the significance through mitigation. So mitigation can be replacement or creation of lost habitat. So you're recreating the habitat that was lost. You lose 100 acres of riparian. How can you recreate and build 100 acres of new riparian habitat somewhere? You can restock a species that maybe wasn't there or was damaged by your project. You can acquire habitat that was threatened with development. Maybe make the action company, agency, or whatever buy some land for a land trust or something. You could do species or habitat monitoring, lots of different things that you can do. And so this is also a good source of funding for environmental projects around the state. So without mitigation, the significance of the project may require an EIS too. So in terms of being a citizen, getting involved in these things, the question of mitigation and an EA is leverage to use with the agency, because they probably don't want to go ahead and make one of these things, these heavy things. They want to try to get away with this little thing here. So if you can give them an out in terms of ways to mitigate the impacts so that they can get away with significance being low enough to just get away with the EA, then you've made some progress. And there's a hierarchy of mitigation. The first thing you try to do is you try to avoid the impact, not taking the action at all, or not doing that one part that's going to have the big impact. The second thing you try to do is just minimize the action, minimize the impact of the project. You can reduce or eliminate the impact. The highway, instead of being 2 lanes in this direction and 2 lanes in that direction, maybe just 1 lane in this direction and 1 lane in that direction and a passing lane. Maybe you can reduce the size of the project. You can compensate for the loss. You can rectify the damages. maybe repair, rehabilitate, or restore, recreate the habitat someplace else. And so the last resort is compensation. And this kind of implies that you've lost the resource, that they had to damage the river bottom. They had to fill up the canyon. So what are we going to do to replace all those acres? Do they have to buy 1,600 acres of farmland along the San Pedro River and additionally give them $20 million as a fund to pay for maintenance of the wildlife area in perpetuity? That's the sort of thing that could happen. I'm not done yet. Okay, so with an EA, you decide to either do a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, or an EIS. So again, with the environmental impact statement, the big heavy one there, these are for major federal actions. If the proposed action will significantly affect the quality of the human environment, major federal action would be, the effects may be major. Not that the action is major so much as the effects are major. And you have some sort of federal nexus. So with an EIS, you do a notice of intent. It starts the process. You start getting public comments. You describe the proposed action in there. And then you start to identify alternatives to be evaluated. And then public scoping begins. It's best to get involved now. And you look at what the impacts are to wildlife and what alternatives should be evaluated. Let's see here. I'm going to move on here to the meat of the stuff here. Some of the things to look for are the purpose and need statement. This should be carefully crafted because it should get at what is the purpose of this project? Why are we building this road? Why are we grazing this? What is the need for all this money being spent and all the impacts that are going to happen? Because everything in the rest of the document has to tear back to the purpose and need. They have to objectively evaluate all reasonable alternatives. Also, there's a requirement for a no action alternative, like no grazing, no new freeway. Okay. And they have to analyze the direct, indirect, or cumulative effects of all alternatives. Some of the things, okay, these big documents like this are really difficult to go through, but you don't have to read the whole thing. These things have a common outline, and you just focus on the parts that interest you. Like if you're into wildlife or riparian habitat, you just look at those sections and focus your time on those. And so you go look at the purpose and need. You look at the different alternatives, and quite often they'll have tables that will quantify the differences of impact between the different alternatives. This many acres will be taken out by alternative A, this many acres will be taken out by alternative 2, et cetera, things like that. Agency must respond to public comments. In the final EIS, they will try to address every single comment everybody submits. They're going to end up with a record of decision. It's the final decision. It identifies the mitigation and monitoring commitments. But in an EIS, it's not necessary to reduce impacts to significance, only to evaluate and disclose the impacts. And quite often the public, I mean, there are projects out there that are so important to the nation as a whole that the public is not going to like them. You know, like putting in a new sewer plant in town or someplace, you're going to get a lot of opposition. All the neighbors don't want it there. Everybody else that has a toilet, they're okay with it though. There is an outline to follow here, and these are, I probably don't have time to go through this very much right now, but if you do any research at all on NEPA, you'll find a flow chart like this, kind of a decision-making tree. But again, NEPA is a framework, a legal framework to appeal or legally challenge federal decisions. There are 3 levels of analysis: CE, EA, EIS. Analyze all reasonable alternatives that address the purpose and need. You need to provide input early, and your goal is to mitigate impacts to wildlife, avoid, minimize, rectify, reduce, or eliminate, then compensate. You read the summary, read the purpose and need, issues sections, et cetera. I think I've already covered this. One thing that is useful sometimes is to maybe suggest a new alternative. So maybe there's another alternative that they haven't put in there, and if you get in early in the process, you can write it up and suggest it, and they might go for it. Talk and work with other reviewers and stand together on issues. So get information from each other and see if you agree, and then if you stand together, then you've got a stronger force. Has data been...
I have to shut Russ down. You know, Russ had a real hard task here because NEPA could take like a 3-day conference to go over NEPA. So he tried to squeeze in as much as he could. Let's give Russ a round of applause for